The animal world or the animal kingdom is filled with suffering and pain. Like if you increase wildlands, if you reduce farming, have you really reduced the net suffering?
Yeah.
You can't even really know that.
Who's going to dictate, like, how is suffering to be avoided? Is it my own whims and desires, or is it going to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's going to tell us or dictate to us how is our suffering to be avoided? Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And this time we have a very important guest who's none other than Yusuf Ponders, also known as Pondering Soul. He has a very popular YouTube channel known as The Pondering Soul, and he's also been featured on channels like the Thought Adventure podcast and also on Sapiens Institute. So today we have a very special topic, something different, which is veganism. And let's start with an introduction. What is this thing on earth called veganism?
Yeah, so I guess more generally, it's just the idea that if someone is a vegan, they just don't eat or consume animal products. So they won't eat honey, they won't drink milk or eat eggs or wear leather. They won't eat meat or fish or anything that's associated with an animal. They just try to avoid. Obviously, people commit to it at varying levels, and you can get everything from like it can go even to more extremes. So you have like fruitarians, which they're basically people that will only eat fruit. And even they, which is already quite extreme, but even they can go to extreme, where it's like, and I guess there's maybe like one person in the world that's ever done this, but there's some people that will only eat fruit that drop from the tree of their own accord.
Oh,
so they won't even pick the fruit. They'll only eat fruit that falls. So that's like the most extreme version of it. It's like, I will only eat fruit that Mother Nature provides to me itself. And then obviously on the opposite end of the scale, you have like the carnivore. The one who only eats meat, only eats animal products. So there's like this sort of spectrum between the series. But generally, veganism is just avoiding the use of animal products for consumption or for wearing. And then you've got like vegetarian who will eat animal products, so they'll have honey. Maybe they'll eat or like drink milk, for example. But they won't. They will just won't eat meat or fish. But they'll maybe wear leather, eat cheese, that kind of stuff. So a vegetarian will do that. And then you have like pescatarian, which is basically like a vegetarian, but they eat fish as well. So there's a varying, and a lot of it has just got to do with this sphere of consideration, and the sphere will increase or decrease depending on who you're talking to, and what they include within the sphere of consideration will change the conception that they may have of themselves. So that they may refer to themselves as a vegan because they include bees in their sphere of consideration, or chickens or whatever, or fish. It increases or decreases, and the word will slightly change.
Yeah. I mean, so that's quite a lot. Like too many things. But what if we say veganism can be divided maybe to people who are just for vegan for health purposes, and maybe there are some people who are for like ideological purposes, and some are for both. So maybe we can relegate this discussion to those who are vegan based on ideological purposes and have a more moral motive behind it.
So then this is two different things. So how does it express itself? So if someone is a vegan, what does that mean? Like when you're looking at them, how would that express itself in the way they act in the world? And then you also have the discussion about the motivations for their particular choice. So if you're a vegan, what was the reason for that? Why are you a vegan? And then you can talk about the underlying motivations for someone picking that lifestyle choice might vary. So someone might, like you say, do it for health reasons. So eating animal products might just they may have irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, and eating animal products like dairy or whatever gives them a bad stomach, and so they've chosen a vegan lifestyle, not because they think it's moral, but because they think it's their a healthy option for their body. And then you've got people that are making more ethical decisions here, and they're saying no, this is an injustice, and they'll make it equivalent to things like the Holocaust, and they'll say we've got the chicken Auschwitz, and obviously I'm not trying to make a light of the Holocaust or anything like that, but this is the language that you'll hear being used within the vegan sphere. For example, these comparisons. So there's a difference in the motivations between people, and that's something maybe we can delve into a little bit. And we could discuss as well.
Yeah. So I think majority of the these people who have these motivations, wouldn't it be fair to say that it is more to do with them having a problem with kind of animal suffering and these slaughterhouses, which kind of implement a lot of cruelty on the animal, and this is the thing they have a problem with. So what is if you try to deconstruct that philosophically, so what is their moral framework, and why do they say something like that, and they have to enable having anything related to animal or consumption of products related to animals completely, what is the drive within this?
Yeah, so if I'm completely honest, it's going to depend on who you're talking to, and they're going to vary. I think for many of them, when you speak to them, they haven't really necessarily taken it down this sort of philosophical route of studying meta ethics and figuring out whether they are utilitarian, consequentialist versus deontological. What is it about this that they think? I think majority of vegans haven't really thought of it to that degree. I think it is mostly a reaction to the mistreatment of animals. So they see something, and this elicits a severe amount of empathy within them, and then they just want to disassociate themselves with that industry altogether, and so they'll push away from it, and they'll flee from it, and they'll pick a vegan lifestyle. Obviously, it is sort of being popularized as well on the internet. It's heavily linked to politics and the whole left-wing sphere in particular, which bases itself a lot on empathy. You see many things being expressed politically, everything from veganism to the LGBT kind of stuff. I would say it depends who you speak to. The average person, it's probably just that they've seen animal cruelty and it's made them sad, so they're moving in that direction. And I think for the more philosophically minded, then probably what's motivating it is some form of utilitarianism, which, for those who don't know, utilitarianism it's an ethical theory that basically posits that good and evil is linked to happiness or pleasure, which is good, and the increase of happiness and pleasure for the greatest amount of beings or people, quote unquote, depending on we were talking about your sphere of consideration. What you're going to take into consideration here depends on who you are and what you're going to consider sentient or whatever. So it's an increase of happiness or pleasure for the greatest amount of beings, whatever they may be for you. Is that doing that or aiming for that is good, and an increase in pain or suffering for the obviously for a larger amount of people is an expression of what is evil. And so they are saying, we are looking at the animal industry, and we recognize that this increases the amount of suffering in the world, and so therefore it is bad and it should be stopped, and we should remove that from our sphere of action, from what we as human beings, we as moral agents, should not be engaging in this type of behavior, because it's only increasing bad, and to stop that would be a way of increasing pleasure in the world, or increasing happiness or general well-being of things in existence. And so therefore the veganism, within this sort of mindset or within this framework, it would be a net good or it would be a move towards what they would see as a justice in the universe.
Okay, so as you mentioned, some propositions have necessary inferences, and most of the time, like, it boils down to utilitarianism, even though people don't realize that they are adhering to a moral philosophy. But you're kind of correct that it kind of boils down to utilitarianism. But utilitarianism as a moral philosophy, so is it right to have utilitarianism as a moral lens to determine things, or maybe that is problematic in some way?
Yeah, I think you're right that most people do fall into utilitarianism even if they don't realize it. And I think a lot of that is because this is a movement, and what you generally find is a lot of the things that are movements in a political sense that express themselves in the public sphere, they always begin in philosophical discussions and they trickle down to the lay people. So what you'll have, I'm obviously not obviously, but for those of you who don't know, I talk about nihilism a lot, and so my study of nihilism is trying to so where did this idea come from, so on and so forth, and you can sort of trace it back to Nietzsche, and you can even go further than back than that and start seeing it in Arthur Schopenhauer. Is that his name? Arthur? I think it's Arthur.
I think.
Can't remember his name. Yeah, but so you can sort of trace this thinking back. And then you can see how it sort of develops in popularity, and then the academia start talking about it, and then that ends up in the public sphere somehow, and then that becomes a conversation that everyone is starting to have. So with things like veganism and things like that, it was popularized by certain thinkers and certain philosophers. I think Peter Singer is probably one of the contemporary thinkers that's really big in terms of behind the push for veganism being common in the public sphere. Not that it wasn't present before them. Obviously, in India, there is a sense of veganism that expresses itself through religion, and not necessarily even through utilitarian conceptions necessarily. Some people might just simply not eat it because they think it's a commandment for them, or because they think it's forbidden for them. Maybe you might know more about this in terms of how
Jainism. We have Jainism. It's more than 2,500 years old religion, or even more than that. So yes. So coming back to utilitarianism, as we spoke about it. So utilitarianism as a concept, as a moral philosophy in itself, is there something is it the right lens to look at it, or maybe it has some loopholes or flaws within it, and how as Muslims, for example, do we have some aspects of utilitarianism, I believe, within our moral framework, but I don't think utilitarianism as a foundation is, in my opinion, is not adequate enough to encompass all
everything.
morals.
I agree.
Yeah.
So the thing is with this, for me, the more fundamental question is why do people feel like we have to fall on this? Because this is what's happening now, and funnily enough, it does kind of link to nihilism and the things that I do talk about a lot. But originally, this wasn't an issue, and in the West in particular. And one of the main reasons was because the source of morality for people in the Christian world in particular was the Bible. And you can see that there is within the Bible certain commandments about it being completely permissible to eat animals, that you can even use them and make sacrifices off them, to give the meat to the poor, so on and so forth. From deriving it from the Bible, or deriving what you decide to be right or wrong from the Bible, is not going to lead you into veganism here, because it's there's clear injunctions that allow it. So in terms of how it ended up developing, is this idea that you did have God as being the arbiter of right and wrong at one point in the West, and then what ends up happening is there's a sort of a loosening of the grip of religion.
So basically, for them, it was more God is being an interfering interloper in some sense, or some why, and maybe they might have a question that why is he the arbiter? Why can't I be my own arbiter?
Yes, yeah. So it becomes seen as a form of oppression. But the thing is people have a sense of morality, that is part of the status quo of a people. And this is interesting. So he said, I'll read the quote and it's sort of, and I'll make a commentary on it as I go through it. So he says, they are rid of the Christian God and now believe more firmly that they must cling to Christian morality, which is a bit of an oxymoron. It's like, well, if you've gotten rid of the Christian God, why would you cling to Christian morality? And he explains it. He says, that is an English consistency. We do not wish to hold it against the little moralistic females a Eliot. I don't know what that. So his reference to English consistency is he had a very big distaste for English moral philosophers, like John Locke, for example, and like he was annoyed with them because they would talk about things like, as if there was this clear way of using reason alone to get to like moral principles, and like so he had his own beef with them. But yeah, so in Eliot. In England, one must rehabilitate oneself after every little emancipation from theology by showing in a veritably awe-inspiring manner what a moral fanatic one is. This is the penance they pay there. So, like, you'll see this with like sort of atheistic activists. They've got to sort of show how moral they are, and there is this push. But the question is well, where is this morality coming from? It is a fundamental question. Exactly. Where is this morality coming from? He says, Wheelers hold otherwise. When one gives up Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. This point has to be exhibited again and again, despite these English flatheads. So, for example, like the universal human rights.
Yeah.
Things like these are underpinned by theological notions that all men are created equal.
Exactly.
Right? But if you don't have that belief in God, a creator, then men are not created equal. Men are not created at all. They're an accidental clump of atoms and cells.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that develop. So
in fact, there's a very good quote from, it reminds me a quote from Elijah. He says that the morality of the non-religious man has its source in religion, but in an earlier forgotten religion. The sun has set, but the vomit of the vomit that radiates in the night comes from the sun.
So this is who said that?
Elijah from Islam Between East and the West, the book. So he's a
contemporary
philosopher. He's a Muslim guy, I think.
Is he contemporary? He's alive today.
I think so.
I think he's recent.
I think not. He's from the 19th century, I think, or the 20th.
Well, you'll see. This is pretty much what Nietzsche is saying here. So he says like despite Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. By breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know what is good for him, what evil. He believes in God, who alone knows. Because you've got to remember, God has a number of attributes. Yeah, that he's the all-knowing, the all-wise. He's the just. He's the merciful. He's this. He's that. And when you're putting your faith in this being to decide the best course of action, the best way for individuals and societies and communities to organize themselves and behave and to deal with each other in their interactions, then like if you believe in this being, then it makes sense to put that faith in him because he's in a better position to dictate the course of actions because he's not just like with children, for example. They have a very, very immediate sense of how they should behave. And what I mean by that is if you give a child ice cream, yeah, they'll eat it and they get a good feeling. Yeah, they like that feeling and they go, it's good. It's good. Like that's as simple. You give them broccoli, they eat it and they go, bleh, it's bad. Because they're not thinking past the immediate experience of that thing. When they put broccoli in their mouth, it doesn't taste sweet. It doesn't taste tasty as far as they're concerned. And so like that's as far as their moral considerations are. So I should not eat broccoli because when I eat it, I have this experience of bad, or I have a displeasing reaction to it. Whereas ice cream, I eat that, it is good because I have this good experience, and they're not thinking beyond the immediate experience of the consumption of this thing. So for them, it's good. And then obviously, as you get older, your sphere of consideration pushes further and further. So you're not now just like when I'm looking at my daughter and I'm like, eat your broccoli. And she's like, no. I'm like, you've got to eat your broccoli. I know you might not like it, but it's good for you. Because in my head, I'm thinking, like, I don't want her to get bloody diabetes. I don't want her feet falling off. If she's only eating ice cream and chocolates and sweets, she's going to become obese. She's going to end up with a number of health problems. I'm thinking further down the line. Yeah.
But so you mean to say we have a wider reference, like, a reference point, so we can. Yeah. Okay, carry on.
Yeah. So I'm considerate of the future, whereas she isn't necessarily, not to the same degree that I am, and she has a limit in terms of how far she can think. In the same way, for example, if me and my daughter start playing chess, my daughter's only 5, yeah. If for whatever reason she can get her head around the rules, and we just take that as a given, let's say she's a little prodigy, she gets how the pieces move, she's not really going to be able to think that many moves ahead. Yeah, if she's a genius as a 5-year-old, maybe she can think 2-3 moves ahead. But 5-year-olds typically, I'm just going to take a shot in the dark and say a 5-year-old typically, if they even could grasp what the rules were, they wouldn't be able to put themselves beyond one move. And not even that, they wouldn't even be able to consider every possibility within the first move. Yeah, they'd go as far as maybe thinking of 1 or 2 things and they pick out of one. If that, maybe they'll just have an instant reaction, I just want to move that there. And then you put them in checkmate and they're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. It's because they're not looking at the board, they're not thinking abstractly in that way, in the same way that we do. But then obviously as you get older, and there's always an exception to the rule, not everyone is going to be as good as others. But when you're looking at people like Magnus Carlsen, whatever his name is, or Carlsen, I can't remember his name, like the world champion. Yeah, even as a teenager, he was smashing people. And one of the reasons is because he had the ability to really abstractly think about the future, about all the possible variations. If I move here, this person can do move A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And if he does move A, I can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. If he does move B, I can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then you're looking through like a tree trunks, and it branches out and spirals out, and you can think about things in many different ways. And there's this sort of, but even then, for the genius, there is a limit to how much we can do that. So the question here is about authority. Now, bringing it back to morality, how should we organize ourselves? Yeah, as individuals and as communities, and as like a global ummah, as a global community. This is a big question. Now, who is best positioned to make those decisions? Now, when you remove God from the picture, which I don't think you can, but the atheist thinks that you can, you remove God from the picture, the question then becomes which person or which community of people should be in charge of dictating the moral norms of a society, what we should and what we should not do. And there's varying opinions in moral philosophy about who that should be. Anything from just one person, a tyrant, a dictator, yeah, who takes it upon himself. You have this in Plato's Republic, you've got Thrasymachus, yeah, and Thrasymachus is the he's like, moral is what is the powerful decide. So if you've got some absolute monarch who is in charge of everything, he decides what is right and wrong. Yeah, so you're just putting that power in one particular individual, and then it goes as far as like everyone. So like democracy. We should all collectively get together and hold hands, sing kumbaya, and say, this is how we will move forward as a people. And, if everyone agrees, great. And if there's a disagreement between the community, then the biggest group wins. Yeah, whoever's like got more numbers is going to be the, yeah. So with like, and obviously that's a very simplified version of the two. And you have varying ways that this can express itself between these two extremes, the single or the entire community. Or is it going to be a subset of the community? For example, is it going to be an oligarch? So is it not just one person, but like a team of people? And what are the motivations for this team of people? Is it just because they've managed to fight and attain that power through brutalism? Or is it because they are trained specialists in economics and in this and in that? Or is it X, Y, Z? There can be a number, but the question is who is it that's going to now dictate the law? Who is going to tell us what is right and wrong? And the issue is when you don't have God, is that you inevitably have to put it into the human being. Yeah, and regardless of the quantity, 1 or 20 or a million, however many human beings are involved in this, there are a number of problems with that, because the human being has a number of attributes that are necessary for them. So, for example, we are finite, we have limited reach, we can only think so far into the future, we have ignorance, we have desires and wants and needs that may conflict with desired outcomes. We've got limited process. We've got biases, limited processing powers. We each have our own world view, and that may dictate certain courses of actions. If you've got a large community of people, all with differing worldviews, differing values, these can come into conflicts and then make it very unclear as to the direction the community should move as a whole. How should we organize a society? Should we allow this? Should we not allow this? Should people be free to burn the Quran, for example, or not? These are questions that you have being expressed in the modern sphere. Now, just to sort of rein this all back in now, because we're talking obviously about veganism.
Yeah.
So the question here is like, veganism is one of these decisions. Yeah, is how should we organize ourselves? Now they are making a moral injunction. They are saying that it is immoral, and they are activists, and they try to say that this is something that should be banned. Typically, you may get some vegans that don't say this, but insofar as we're talking about it as a popular movement that's currently expressing itself in the news, on social media, etc., they are evangelical. They want you to accept their moral principles and to join them in their fight. Yeah, they are giving dawah, essentially. They want you to accept that they are right, and that eating animal products or like using animal products is an injustice, and so that you should act as they act. And part of that is to ban factory farming. Part of that is to ban, in some cases, farming altogether. To ban the eating of animal products wholesale. You should not be allowed to eat meat. As a community, we should make this something that is not permissible. Obviously, there's going to be some that are like, oh, it's a personal choice if you want to or not, blah, 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 blah. But in terms of the way that it's expressing itself in the political sphere, veganism, I would say most popularly, is the notion that it is immoral, and that this is something that we should all do together. We should all become vegan. We should all work towards that and stop all of these things. But the question is, and this is where the critique is going to come in, does it really get the desired outcome, and how can they be so sure? And other things we need to take into consideration is, if you're using utilitarianism here, you know, this idea that we need to reduce suffering for the greatest amount of beings, you know, then how do we measure that? How do we measure that? How do we weigh suffering? How do we weigh pleasure? And how can we be so sure that the course of action that we decide now will in fact reduce the net amount of suffering in the long run, yeah, or increase it? How can you be so sure? Now, they think it's just a given that a certain course of action, just preventing factory farming, for example, is necessarily going to reduce the amount of suffering in the universe. Yeah, and that's what's up for question here, because it's not necessarily the case. So just to sort of finish this quote, so he says, when the English actually believe that they know intuitively what is good and evil, when they therefore suppose that they no longer require Christianity as a guarantee of morality, we merely witness the effects of the dominion of Christian value judgment and an expression of the strength and depth of this dominion, such that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, such that the very conditional character of its right to existence is no longer.
I think I missed. After the second line, I mean, can you read that again? Because I think it.
Yes.
Buffering.
Bismillah. So when the English actually believe that they know intuitively what is good and evil, because when you speak to the average person, they're like, it's so obvious. It's so obvious that it's wrong. Why should like, you know, they're forgetting that like there is a social aspect to these feelings that they have. Yeah. And this notion, and so. It's not something you can divorce from your environment completely, and this bleeds into many different subjects, like, you know, the slavery, for example, or so on and so forth, polygyny, you know, the ability to marry more than one wife. So, you know, they suppose that it's intuitive what is good and evil when they therefore suppose that they no longer require Christianity or religion at all as a guarantee of morality. We merely witness the effects of the dominion of the Christian value judgment, or in this case, any religion, religious value judgment, and an expression of the strength and depth of the dominion, such that the origin of English morality has been forgotten, such that the very conditional character of its right to exist is no longer felt. For the English, morality is not yet a problem. Or even more specifically, for the Western secular liberal, is no longer a problem, because they'll talk about human rights and they'll talk, but like this is a hangover, from the Western Enlightenment, quote unquote, where they've developed this system of thought that all men are created equal and there are certain rights that are God given and so on and so forth, and they've sort of like removed God from that. But now the question is as well, if they're not God given, who gives them?
Yeah.
And if and why are they absolutes? Why are they absolutes? Why is it the case that this is not like, what is it as an, and obviously this is something that when people start asking or going into, reasons for justification start to crop in, and what people generally tend to do is they'll incline towards empathy. And they'll say, oh, but if you're a good person, you'll just feel the same way that I do. You'll just have empathy for the pain of others. And it's like, well, that's a bit circular, isn't it? Like, because what if I don't have that empathy? What if I don't give a crap? What if I'm a psychopath? And it's just, and obviously I'm not saying this is like my feelings. I have empathy for animals and for people. But so there are people in the world that don't. And you saying, oh, well, you should do. If they don't give a, who are you? If you're just some random person to them, they don't see you as an authority figure. They're going to ask the question, why am I taking you as an authority? Exactly. Who are you? Who are you?
How does objective just because you are saying it is?
Exactly. And even then, like, how are you so sure that your course of actions does lead to even the outcome that you want? So, for example, you get rid of factory farming and you try to turn these buildings or this land that's typically used for rearing animals into wild areas. Does that decrease suffering? Have you been in the wild? Have you ever seen how much of a dog-eat-dog world the wild is? Like, you're not necessarily decreasing the amount of suffering at all. Take a plot of land.
Okay. Yeah.
And this land is typically used for rearing animals, let's say sheep. And the vegan here is saying, if you prevent this for being used for animal farming, this is going to somehow decrease the amount of suffering, because we're not going to be sending these sheep to the slaughterhouse. But funnily enough, my sister lives on a sheep farm. So she's got sheep and they live there. And for the majority of the year, this farm is not giving rise to suffering. It's just, it's not the case. The sheep are looked after. The sheep are fed. The sheep are taken care of. The sheep, if they become ill, are seen to by veterinary specialists that work on them, that, like, even if they've got something dodgy with their teeth, or if they become sick, or they get a virus, or they have an infection in their foot, whatever it is, a human being will come and relieve them of that suffering. And for the most part, their life is quite comfortable. And there was a brief moment at the end when they go to a slaughterhouse, if they go to a slaughterhouse at all. But for the most part, like, their life is very comfortable. And you can go there, and obviously the vegans will show you videos where there's mistreatment of animals, but I wouldn't say this is typical. This is not typical of a farm, especially in the UK. Like, if you go to farms, you don't typically see the mistreatment of animals. It's something quite rare, relatively speaking. There are certain things like the mass housed chickens, for example, which are maybe a bit more controversial. But if you're looking at sheep or whatever, goats, you're not going to see it to the same degree as you would do caged hens. But to talking specifically here about whether or not, for example, if you remove this farm, this sheep farm that my sister lives on, have you decreased the amount of suffering? Now, if that turns into wild lands, what happens in wild lands? You have a hierarchy, a pecking order, a food chain. And if this becomes wild land, this becomes ample grounds for competition to occur within the animal kingdom. Things are going to start spreading out into this land. They're going to start competing for territory. They're going to start competing for food. owls are going to be hunting mice, so on and so forth. And obviously, the smaller you go, the more, in terms of the millions, you can take these things into consideration. So even if you're just thinking about mice are considered to be within the sphere of animal consideration, because we're talking about them when we're talking about animal testing. We don't want, the vegan doesn't want animal testing to occur on mice. And mice can populate a field in vast numbers. Rabbits can populate a field in vast numbers. Foxes can populate a field in vast numbers. Owls can populate a field, yeah? And so in terms of the amount of animals that end up living in these areas, yeah, it's going to increase. And the more animals there are, the more predator-prey relationships there's going to be. Yeah. So there's going to be an increase in this particular square mileage of the amount of death, and the amount of killings and suffering and pain. Now, is that bad?
Yeah, exactly. And then there can be one example. For example, if there's an owl that has attacked a mice, and the mice somehow runs away, but is scarred, really scarred,
injured, which links to the other thing I was mentioning. Exactly. So now we were talking about how on a farm, if an animal becomes sick, like a sheep gets an infection in its foot or whatever, a veterinary specialist can come and check on it. In the wild, it is brutal. If you get toothache, nothing you can do about it. Yeah. If you get a splinter in your paw and it becomes infected, there's not much you can do about it other than lick it. And if that infection becomes worse and worse and worse and worse, and it requires some sort of surgical removing, the application of antiseptics, a bandaging, treatment and care, cleaning, etc., that's not available in the wild. And this happens more frequently than you would think, where things become ill, hurt, so on and so forth. The wild is not like you would think, the way some people sort of imagine it. They beautify, or they sort of turn the wild into this sort of utopia. And it's a beautiful place to a certain degree, but it is not absent of suffering. It is not absent of carnage, of animals eating the faces of another animal. Yeah, just an eagle alone, the way that it kills things can be so brutal. There was a video floating around on the internet where this eagle just picks up this rat, and the rat's like absolutely panicking, and then it just lands directly in front of a security camera, and then it just starts eating its face, just on camera, and then it's just eating this thing. Like it looked absolutely horrifying. And there's videos like you've got like lions and tigers eating things while they're still alive. Sometimes it's with the younger ones in particular. The older ones know how to kill an animal, but the young are like, bro. Like I did a couple videos on veganism, and there's one of them where I'm showing these videos where there's like 3 young lions eating a water buffalo, and they're just sort of eating it like they're all sat around the dinner table, like just nom 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 nom. But they've not made the effort to kill it. So this water buffalo can't move. It's just sat down with these 3 young lions eating it, and it's just like it's not enjoying the experience at all. Or there's one where there's like, I can't remember if it's coyotes or hyenas or something, and they're just like, they all grab hold of this rabbit or some small mammal, and they're just ripping it into shreds. Like so the animal world, or the animal kingdom, is filled with suffering and pain.
And clearly doesn't believe in utilitarianism.
And what, sorry?
It clearly doesn't believe in utilitarianism.
Yeah, so there's... Exactly. And so these things are engaging with each other in this manner.
Yeah.
So the question of, like, if you increase wildlands, if you reduce farming, have you really reduced the net suffering?
Yeah.
You can't even really know that, not even on an immediate level. But then if you were to go and extrapolate that over generations and generations and generations and generations, how do you know? How can you say that this decision now really has reduced the amount of suffering in the world or increased the amount of happiness? How is this really, utilitarianly speaking, necessarily a better world 100 years down the line? Yeah, how can you be so sure? What is it? Because these are subjective experiences. How do you compare the suffering, for example, of a mouse to, say, a sheep, a fully grown sheep? Yeah, is it the case that because the mouse is smaller, that it is due less consideration than something that's a bit bigger? Yeah, so does the suffering of a mouse equate to less than the suffering of a sheep? Or is it relatively speaking? If you slap a mouse, yeah, with the same amount of force that you slap a sheep, the sheep might not even flinch, but that might feel like an absolute punch to a mouse. So it might require more consideration for the mouse. Like, how do you approach this? There's so many questions that we just can't simply ask. Well, that we need to ask that we can't simply answer, should I say?
Yeah.
Like, how do you weigh it? How do I know that this particular action should deserve more moral consideration than this one, when I can't even weigh pleasure and pain? It's not like I can, like there's the object here. Like it says here that it weighs 250 milliliters. Yeah. And it's vegan approved, by the way, for the vegans watching this film. But I can weigh that. I can say the liquid in this cup, it has a volume of 250 milliliters. Which is probably about 250 grams as well. So, like, I can say objectively, this is how much it is. So this is more than, say, a half-filled one that's only got 125 milliliters in it. Can I do that with suffering? Yeah. How do I compare? And not just that. Like, there is suffering involved from the human side of things as well. Like being a vegan or being, I used to be vegetarian or pescatarian. Okay. And that lifestyle can be very difficult. Like they say, so you're telling me you only want to eat an animal because it gives you joy. I thought the experience of joy was supposed to be a good thing, number one, if you like from a utilitarian perspective, the increase of joy. But they're saying at the expense of the pain of something else. Okay, but if I'm not eating this particular diet and I'm looking at all of these other things, I'm like, I wish I like vegan cheese, yeah, or vegan milk alternatives. I'm sorry, but they're just not the same. They're not the same. There's certain cheeses that might be all right, but number one, they're expensive. Yeah, and not everyone can afford them to the same degree. So they become something that you can hardly ever have. Number two, even if you can afford them, they're not really the same. Like almond milk in a cup of tea does not give me the same sense of satisfaction as a proper milk. Yeah, like there is a different taste, and this can affect your mood, especially if life is already difficult enough. Yeah, and it's these little things that uplift you. Being on a vegan diet can give rise to, I'm not saying it's necessarily the case or that anyone who becomes a vegan is going to end up depressed, but like limiting your food choices to these type of things limits your access to that dopamine that you would have got if you had otherwise eaten things like a meat product, a cheeseburger or this or that. Yeah. And if that does give rise to like depression in a person, why should you not take that person's experience of suffering, of life feeling like it's not as good as it used to be because they can't just eat whatever they want, the stress and the pressure of having to think about all of these other things, like does have my fries been cooked in, something that blah blah blah. Like there is a lot of stress involved in these sort of dietary requirements and the considerations, trying to find somewhere where you can just be accepted, constantly stressing about the suffering in the world, like giving way too much attention to certain events going on in the world. If that increases, like, are these vegan activists, are they not even taking into consideration their own suffering in this?
For example,
or the suffering of
for a vegan, for example, like if they want to, if they have a limit of a bar to set, for their daily protein intake, they have to take a lot of, for example, these seeds and these kind of things, which is not on a regular basis for your whole life. You just imagine you have to have this amount of peanut butter and this amount of quinoa, for example, or these kind of things to complete your daily protein intake. That is a big hassle. Yeah.
But some people it's relatively easy. Like I've seen, there are vegans that do this. They even get a sense of joy out of it. I'm not going to pretend that there isn't. But for the average person who's already got so much that they're trying to think about, they're trying to pay the bills. Like they're just your standard average Joe that lives on a council estate in the West somewhere in the UK. Yeah, and he's got to make sure he's paying his bills. Food prices are already shooting up through the roof as it is. The cost of living, his gas, his electric, his rent are all going up. And like he's trying to work, and when he wants to get home, he just wants to bloody have some time to relax and to chill and to wind down. And when he gets home, now he's stressing about making sure he's got to have X amount of chia seeds and X amount of sunflower seeds and X amount of peanuts and X amount of this and X amount of that, and he's got to try and make sure that he's got all of this intake. Because this is the thing, it's like, when, you know, this is one argument that vegans bring sometimes. You say, you know, well, where am I going to get all of my intake from? I need to eat animals to be able to get my daily level of proteins that I need, or blah 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 blah. They go, where do you think the animals that you eat get their protein from? I said, yeah, but what does a cow do? Does nothing but eat. It spends all day walking around eating. That's its life. Yeah, it doesn't have time to do anything else. It's got 4 stomachs to process all of this stuff as well. And that's literally all it does, is it just lives, eats, poops, chills out every now and then, sits in the sun, walks about, drinks a bit of water, eats a bit more. It spends all day eating, constantly, every day. I do not have that privilege. I can't just spend all my days just eating pure spinach and, you know, and constant. And the thing is like, you've got to have these things in such high volumes that you've got to constantly fill your belly with food. You can't. Right. It's not as dense as, say, meat is. And one of the, obviously, you're sort of offloading the amount of time that it takes to get that amount of protein via vegetation onto an animal, and you eat the animal so that you don't have to invest as much time and effort into attaining all of that protein as, say, you know, any particular animal did. So that's something else that needs to be taken into consideration. Is it really, because if it is about pleasure and pain, like, they'll often put forward this as like a sort of rebuttal to the one that says, oh, but I enjoy eating animal products. It gives me a sense of happiness. It gives me a sense of pleasure. They'll dismiss that as if it's fallacious. But then, like, the experience of pleasure and pain is a whole part of why you shouldn't be eating animals, as far as they're concerned. Exactly. And if say, for example, if my diet, eating a vegan diet causes me so much stress, trying to make sure blah 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 blah, I'm not enjoying the food. I don't like almond milk in my tea. I don't like almond milk in my cereal. Like, if my experience of my food is just like, I do not enjoy this at all, but I need the fuel, and you're just putting it in. But I hate the aftertaste of almond milk, or if I hate the aftertaste of this, if this is bringing me and my general happiness levels down, why is that not being taken into consideration as well? If this is something that leads me into a state of depression or even suicidal behavior at some point in the future, does it become moral for me then to eat meat? Or is it, because this is the thing as well, so they sort of flip that when they're giving you arguments as to why you shouldn't eat meat. Sometimes there'll be this sort of consequentialist that gives rise to suffering, so on and so forth. We sort of undermine this notion that, to a certain degree, obviously they can try to rebut it, and they will do. But my issue with a consequentialist approach is that it's really, really, really difficult to really say if this is removing suffering. I think you can even make an argument to say there could be an increase in suffering. I think you can even make an argument, a vegan argument, for eating animals. So let's take this into consideration. What has more suffering in it? A short life, or B, a long life?
Exactly, you can't say. I mean, depends on the life, right? And then
typically typically
speaking,
like,
you know, in some scenarios A would have more suffering, and in some scenarios B would have more suffering. And okay, I think it makes more sense to say that if B has more suffering, because you have more life, so you'll have more suffering throughout. Like, you know, you'll have a more timeline to have more suffering, add more suffering into that timeline.
So you were correct in your first approach. So you were saying that it does depend on the life. Like, life A, although it's short, might be filled with a lot more suffering than life B. But typically speaking, if we're talking about the opportunity to experience pain, I think generally speaking, a longer life is going to have more instances of suffering occur in it than a shorter life. So now the question is let's take a being X, yeah? So we say this sheep, we'll call him Shaun the sheep.
Yeah.
And Shaun the sheep has lived his life for 2 years. Yeah? Now, if we kill him now, we slaughter him and we turn him into some delicious food. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is he going to experience more or less suffering. Let's say we slaughter him halal, yeah? We get a sharp knife, cover his eyes, he can't see what's going on, cross the jugular, he bleeds out, he falls unconscious within seconds, and he's dead within a minute, yeah? And not only that, because he's unconscious and because you've used a sharp knife, the amount of suffering that he's experienced is quite minimal, yeah? Because I've had friends, by the way, who have been stabbed and didn't know they were stabbed. They had to be told by someone, "You've been stabbed." Yeah, and he's like, "What do you mean?" And he's looked, and he's turned around, and he's looking at his back, and there's blood all over his back.
Oh my God.
And the reason he didn't know is because the knife that was used was a very sharp knife. It was a Stanley knife, and it went straight in and straight out, and he didn't feel a thing. Yeah, and so. That's the whole point of a sharp knife when you're using halal, because you're trying to reduce the suffering. A blunt knife, you're going to feel that go in. If someone's trying to stab you with a butter knife, you're going to feel that. Like, yeah, it's going to hurt. But if someone stabs you with a very, very sharp knife, you don't feel it. Yeah, it cuts through you like a knife cuts through butter. And so the whole point is that you use a sharp knife, so this reduces the amount of suffering that it experiences. You cut across the jugular, which stops oxygenated blood from going to the brain. When oxygenated blood ceases to go to the brain passes out. They go unconscious. And while they're unconscious, they don't feel things. Why do you think we give patients anesthesia when we're operating on them? Because when they're unconscious, they don't feel the pain.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're going onto an operating table and they're trying to cut your appendix out, you're given anesthesia. This knocks you out, and so you can no longer feel the suffering. Yeah, because you're unconscious. Or like historically, before all of this was brought about, yeah, if someone was being operated on and they did feel pain, what would happen? They would fall unconscious, and then wake up later. Yeah,
right.
Like the falling unconscious is like the body's reaction, or
response,
the defense mechanism, because the pain is just too much. It's like nope, and it just opts out, and it's like God. Yeah, but like when you cut the jugular, you sort of force this upon the body. Yeah, because there's no oxygen going to the brain. It's unconscious. It's not feeling that pain, and then it bleeds out. Once it's bled out, it's dead. Yeah. So you've got maybe a few seconds at most if you're doing it right. If you've done a proper job, proper halal, you cut properly right across the jugular. The knife is as sharp as the knife is ever going to get. Yeah. That animal is not going to experience suffering for long, if it experiences any suffering at all. Yeah. People look at it and it might twitch. And they get confused and think the twitching is an expression of pain, but it isn't necessarily at all. It can be the expression of the nerves firing through the body, and it's just sort of like, the random juts of a body that's had nerves cut. So now the question is has Shaun the sheep?
People say that it is because maybe because there is less blood, the body is trying to something related to blood, is trying to accumulate blood, or
maybe
blood somewhere. Something along those lines is also one explanation. Anyway.
So you've got the first thing that you've done. So option one, you've got Shaun the sheep. Shaun the sheep has lived for 2 years. You slit his throat. He experiences however amount of pain he experiences in that process of slaughtering. Yeah. Now, let's say we didn't do that at 2 years and we let him live. I don't know how long sheep live, but let's say they live for 10 years. And you let Shaun the sheep live for another 8 years. Which of the lives is Shaun the sheep going to have experienced more suffering? Life A, A where you slaughtered him at 2 years, or life B where you've allowed him to live for 10.
Yeah,
so he's had an extra.
And then we have to also consider that within these 2 years, this Shaun the sheep has been taken fully care of, where if he goes through any kind of suffering, any kind of toothache or something, there is a doctor, there's a vet that comes and tries to do his best to ease out his suffering for these 2 years. And maybe, for example, if Shaun the sheep is in the wild and he lives for like 10 years, hypothetical scenario could be like he might have had some kind of a disease and he has to live with those diseases for like years, or maybe for some injury or something like that. And maybe it could be that he could injure one of his leg, and he cannot even walk properly, and then
and he eventually starves to death because he can't get to the food or whatever. Like, it could be a very slow death process. Now, so the question here is, which one has less suffering? So if the answer to this question is that, and I think it's necessarily so, yeah, that an animal that's lived for 2 years is going to experience less suffering than the very same animal if it is led to live longer. Because every day that it lives increases its opportunity to experience pain. Yeah. Now, what that means is that if it is a problem of suffering, then, and you don't want the animal to suffer, then you would be obligated to end the life of the animal as quickly as possible. Because if it lives, that necessarily means that it is going to experience pain. And if pain in and of itself is necessarily an evil and you need to prevent it from happening, you want to prevent the animal from experiencing any pain whatsoever, then just slaughter it now. Slaughter it now, right, and eat that meat, because if you don't, it's going to go to waste and something else is going to eat it anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah? Now, we can take it even further. If life itself necessitates suffering and suffering is itself pain, then what obligation have we got to allow life to begin at all? So this is an anti-natalist argument.
Yeah, exactly. We can move into anti-natalism. So, but just before moving into anti-natalism, that this reminds me of something I had gone through a few years back, I believe, is people who talk about techniques of torture, and then they have mentioned one of the worst techniques of torture is just tying a human being and a drop of water on your head every second. And then if you, for example, just imagine if that goes on, and that is one of the worst forms of torture, just by just a single drop of water just on your forehead again and again constantly. I mean, in a prolonged period of time, if that can be a very big indicator of torturing someone, which implies that in a scale of time, small amounts of suffering can be a lot, and
yeah, because they describe it as being like a dagger hitting them on the head every second. Eventually, because it's been so constant that they can't stand it. So yeah, this assumption that like not slaughtering an animal is somehow going to reduce the amount of suffering is, I would say, problematic, because I think it necessarily follows that an animal that lives for longer is going to suffer more than an animal that lives less. And there are ways that you can kill an animal that don't include suffering. Yeah, so obviously we have the halal way of doing things, but even for the atheist, like you don't have to have let's say you've got a problem with factory farming. Okay, yeah, are there other ways of slaughtering animals? There's lots of ways. They've got lots of ways. They stun them. They do the bolt gun through the head. Like if you could regulate it, yeah, you could regulate it in such a way so that like you reduce the amount of suffering in the slaughtering process. That's perfectly possible. You could ban things like caged hens.
Yeah.
If that is the problem, if it's more to do with methodology, then we can reconfigure the way that we treat these animals and implement a way in which, like, even from an atheist perspective, that where they're not concerned about thinking about, and like even milk.
Yeah, one important point is that we are also not implying that we kind of are okay with all kinds of suffering. Rather, it would be we as Muslims, we would dictate that we also have been mandated to to avoid suffering as much as possible. But we wouldn't say that who's going to dictate how is suffering to be avoided. Is it my own whims and desires, or is it going to be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's going to tell us or dictate to us how is our suffering to be avoided? And I believe
not just that. Sorry, go on. Sorry.
Yeah,
I get excited.
I believe we would say that we would consider Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command on how to avoid suffering, and we as Muslims, we have rights for animals, and those are very strict, I believe, rights for animals, and we ourselves try to implement that as much as possible and try to avoid animal suffering as much as possible. But then that is in accordance with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command and not with our own whims and desires, I believe. I think
But also that draws us now to another question: is all suffering bad?
Exactly.
So now because I can make an argument now that says that suffering can be a necessary part of building good character, and this saying has been like deeply pushed into pretty much every society. That I think you probably heard it, that strong men give rise to
weak men.
Good times. Good times give rise to weak men. Weak men give rise to hard times. Hard times give rise to strong men. Strong men give rise to good times. So there's this notion, that good times creates weakness. And weakness in people gives rise to difficult times, because weak men do not do the things that they need to do in order to maintain good times. And there's good examples of this, and we can make reference to the animal world, where I was watching a documentary, I can't remember, David Attenborough or something. I was talking about these tribes of lions, or whatever they call it, a pride of lions. And there was a certain pride of lions that were doing really well. And the young in this pride were well fed. They didn't have to try hard to get food. You know, they were just given everything on a plate. They lived in luxury as far as a pride of lions is concerned. And there was another group of lions that was sort of ostracized. And the youth from this ostracized group struggled. They had great difficulty in attaining food. They really had to like put a lot of effort and energy in. Like the young from this pride had to fight. Some of them died off because of the difficulties that they were facing. But the ones that survived, when they grew older, they were very strong, very competitive, and very capable. And the cubs that grew in the affluent pride were weak, were not trained very well because they didn't, things were in abundance. And what turned out in the long run is that the youth from the affluent pride were better prepared for difficulty or for competing against the youth from the ostracized pride, or from the ostracized group of lions. And so they ended up becoming more capable of being the alphas or the leaders of the community. And eventually they took over because they were strong. They were hit with adversity. They went through pain and suffering and learned how to overcome it. Whereas the affluent pride hadn't really been experienced to any pain or suffering. And so when it came, it was more difficult for them to deal with it. We see that even in humans, when it's like, you look at affluent people, you look at the West, and if you look at the expressions of poverty on the news in England, and it can shock you because you're looking and like you'll see someone talking about how hard life is on the news, and there's a number, and I've seen it so many times, it's become a pattern where you'll see someone talking about poverty. They'll be overweight. They're overweight, so they're getting more than enough calories. They're getting so many calories that they've managed to put weight on. Obviously, there's complexities here as to all the different factors that face into that. But they're not starving to death. They're not dying of dehydration. Like in Bolton, in particular, we can drink water straight out of our taps. If I want, I can go fill my glass up now with water from the tap, drink it, and not have to worry about anything. I'm not going to get sick later on. I drink water from the tap all the time, and I'm fine. It's just not a thing we worry about, especially in the north. There's different parts of the UK, it's a bit different. But the point is that I can drink water. I've got food. They've got food. They've got one of them. I was watching it, and this woman was complaining. She had Gucci glasses on. Gucci glasses. She had a big widescreen flat TV on the wall behind her, like 50 odd inch. She had an iPhone. She had a newer iPhone than I did.
Wow.
And she's like, she's got all of this stuff, and I'm looking, and she's complaining about poverty. And I'm like, Gucci glasses, flat screen TV, overweight, iPhone. How are you poor? How are you poor? You've not, like, if you've not got to the point where you're like, I have to sell these things in order to get food, and you've just got like, you know, when you take an old picture off the wall, you've just got that square. It's because the picture's been up there so long. Like, if you've not got that square, the clean square where the TV used to be, because you had to sell your TV to get your food, and you don't have a phone anymore, so you can't communicate with the outside world, and you had to sell your Gucci glasses, so now you're just wearing like, some ones that you bought from Boots for $5. Like, if you can, how can you really describe yourself as being destitute? And then in this, let's say we were to bring images of some of the conditions that people living in India. Oh, you're frozen. Are you there still? I think I've lost you.
Yeah, I'm back.
Look, you're back. I lost you. Yeah. So take that person, that's on the news in the UK complaining about how destitute they are, and then let's take someone, for example, that lives in a shanty town in India.
Yeah.
Yeah. The conditions that they live in, where like literally the house that they live in is just a collection of scrap that's been nailed together. Yeah. They've got the sewage that runs through the street. There's like the conditions that they are going through at exponentially worse than the experience of this particular individual in a Western nation. Yeah.
Right.
So, what was the point of that? Why did I mention this now?
Yeah. So it's because suffering does not necessarily lead to
Oh yeah. So suffering is not necessarily a bad thing. So, and I can guarantee you, like if you go and speak to some of the people that live in shanty towns in India, they probably have more character, more generosity in them, more empathy.
Yeah.
For many things than you would someone that lives in the UK on a council estate that has all of these things and takes them for granted. Yeah, and still thinks they're poor. Allah says in the Quran, is it in the Quran or in the Hadith, that Adam alayhi salam is the son of Adam is so greedy that they desire the mountain of gold, and when they achieve that, they do not become satisfied, but yet they want another. Yeah, this is what the human being is. Yeah, so if that's the case, right, and suffering is something that builds character in people. Suffering is something that develops a person, yeah, and makes them stronger. And not just human beings, but we see this being present within the animal kingdom as well. That obviously there's a sweet spot. Too much suffering can lead to the deterioration of a being, and not enough can lead to the deterioration. So there's some sweet spot. Yeah.
So for example, when we take pets only, for example, you have a pet cat and you have a stray cat, if you compare, for example, if you leave the pet cat even out for a day, and it does not know how to get its food, it does not, there are memes people share that stray cats, it shows that I've fought snakes, I've fought mouse to get my food, and then the pet cat is like I just had tap water and I'm sick because of
meow. Meow. And it's like that's the way the house cat gets its food. It just meows and like strokes the cupboard where the food is. Where's my slave human?
But that also reminds me of a reel of I had recently gone through where there was one guy who was complaining that he had just one private jet, and and this is kind of his parents are throwing him into some kind of a poverty because he does not possess all these things. And I'm like, oh my god, I mean, how can people say that?
But it's the thing, is because there is a relativity to the suffering. Yeah, exactly. It depends on who you are. Like, for example, someone who lives at the bottom and isn't used to high standards of living, eventually this bottom can feel normal. Yeah, this way of being becomes normal, and like little things. So if you've got someone that's not who maybe eats once every few days, yeah, and they eat simple foods like rice or whatever, just something very, very plain, very simple, not too much, not very complex, just because that's all that their means is capable of providing. If that is the way that they live, and they don't have access to other people, yeah, because this is important. There's a study, I can't remember what it's called, I did a video on it, where people that live in poverty together don't experience being poor. Yeah. Okay. So long as there isn't something that they can compare themselves to. So a tribe that lives in the middle of nowhere in Africa, yeah, they might only live in simple huts, yeah, and they may have to travel to a river to get their water. They may have to travel to catch food and eat, and they wear simple clothing, yeah, and they eat simple foods. They can be happy. They can experience that life and not consider it a life of poverty if everyone is on the same level. As long as they have the major sources of needs fulfilled, they have shelter, they have food, they have water, they have community. Yeah, if they've got these things, they can be happy in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, with no iPhone, no access to the internet. Yeah. No chocolate, no sweets, no ice cream. Like they can function. Yeah. Now, if you compare that, and like India's a good example here, because in India you get this crazy thing that happens sometimes where you've got like the shanty towns, and they're built next to skyscrapers.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's other places where this happens, but like India in particular, you have this, and you'll get these really big buildings. You get these very affluent areas, and the view from the affluent areas is a shanty town just down the road. When you're poor and you live in these conditions, and you can see people that live in a different condition to you, you feel more poor. You feel it. Right. So there could be, like, for example, in the UK, I gave you that example of the person that was saying that, they're crying out destitution.
Exactly.
With Gucci glasses,
with Gucci glasses, TV, and an iPhone.
Yeah, an iPhone. Yeah, and the access to the internet. They got running water. They have heating. Yes, it's expensive, but they have it still. They don't have money for going out drinking every night. They don't have money for luxuries, but quote unquote, or they've got certain luxuries, but like these things, they just sort of take them for granted and consider it like a base. That's their baseline. For them, like I'm supposed to have a TV. What are you on about? It's a human right. It's a human right to have a mobile phone and access to the internet. That's not something I should beg for. Yeah, it's just something I should have as a base level. That's like the neutral position. But and that's just because they're used to it. They've lived around it so long that they don't experience awe when they look at these things. Yeah, or someone who comes from like a simple living, where, like we said, they just eat simple foods. They live in a little shanty town out in the middle of nowhere. So if you give them something like a washing machine, that's going to blow their mind. They're going to be like, what? A washing machine? What? And you give them like a solar power thing that charges it. And the elders are like, what do you mean? And they're used to going down to the river and spending hours and hours washing their clothes. But this is normal for them. That's just what they do. So it doesn't even cause them pain. That's like a standard, That's just something they do, part of their daily life. And they can sit down and do it and talk to each other and enjoy it. And then you give them a washing machine. And they're going to be like, what do you mean? It's like, just put your clothes in here, press that button, walk away. Come back in 2 hours. And your clothes will be cleaner than they've ever been in your life. Smell them. It smells lovely. It's clean. And the only effort you had to exert was you pressed this button here. That's going to blow their mind. That's going to fill them with awe. They're going to be like, this is amazing. But how many people that have this in their life every day experience that? Right. That sense of awe. They don't, because it's just a part of their daily life. So, this going back to it now, this notion of suffering, it can develop character. Suffering, to a certain degree, might like a certain event might cause one person suffering, but it won't cause another person suffering. Exactly. Because if that's a part of your daily life, it's something you can acclimatize to. And like, for example, loss, death. People that experience death all the time are much less sensitive to it. If you go back in the day, like everyone would, children were dying all the time. Yes, it was sad to them, but it's not going to be as traumatizing as it would be to someone that lives in the West and hasn't ever experienced a child death. And then a child dies, the whole world shuts down almost. Like in the UK, especially, like it's not that common for people to experience the death of someone young. So when it happens, like an entire community goes into severe grief because of that. But if you grow up in the medieval times where like every family loses 50% of its children at birth. That's not gonna hit you as hard as it would for those who don't experience that. So, again, like these things, the context of the individuals, how do you weigh these things? All of this, the fact that some pain can be considered good, especially if you're thinking in long term. Like we go to the gym, like if you were to just treat the gym in terms of your even if you're thinking into the future, like I went to the gym for like a year, and I made progress, but it wasn't that visible. Like you couldn't see it that much. It wasn't, for me, it was like, am I even changing? Other people would mention, oh, have you lost weight? But it's like, I don't even feel like I have. Like I feel not much same. I still feel like I've got a bit of a gut. Yeah. The process is so slow and so painful. Like I was getting up at 4:30 every morning, going to the tired. You'd spend like an hour or 2 hours like in the gym and you're sweating and you're aching. It's like, oh, my body hurts. Oh, I've pulled a muscle again. Oh, my shoulder. I'm such a noob. I don't know how to do these things properly. Oh, I'm like, and like it affects you. And like if you're just looking at in terms of that, even if it's not just the immediate, but months and months of just experiencing pain and sweat and tired and throwing up and all, you're going to go, this is bad for me. You're just going to stop it.
Exactly.
Yeah? But that's not true, is it? We know that persistent, consistent exercise is good for you, despite the fact that your immediate experience for months and months might be a negative one. But it's something that you should push through and continue. And okay, so now that's just on like an individual basis, yeah, with regards to like one little thing. Now let's think in terms of how, if you extrapolate that to a society, to a global community, where there may be certain things that cause certain individuals discomfort or pain in the short time, yeah, but for a greater good in the long run. Yeah, this notion of, you know, of sacrifice, of dedication, of duty, etc. These things cause suffering in individuals, yeah, maybe even in a large number of them, but it's for the betterment of the society in the long run. In the same way that exercise might not be enjoyable, like I don't really enjoy it that much. Like I like it. Like for example, I love the Stairmaster. That's one thing I do enjoy. And I'll go on it. But it took me a while to like even get to a point where I liked it. But like especially at the end of it, because it makes me sweat a lot. Like I don't know if you I've got you on WhatsApp. Have you seen the pictures that I post sometimes on my WhatsApp?
Sometimes I do, yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, like so when I'm on the Stairmaster, like I more so because I can go and do, you know, weightlifting and that, but I can sweat definitely, especially if you like bench pressing and that. But not to the degree that I do if I spend 40 minutes running upstairs. I mean running, like, you know, like you're proper, you go with like HIIT, so you'll do high intensity for like a minute, and then you'll drop it down until you get your breath back, and then high intensity again for a minute. After, like while I'm doing it, sweat is dropping off of my elbows. Like it's so satisfying because you know you're doing something there, like I'm burning things. Yeah, but that was not easy to get to. Yeah, that it was very difficult because at the beginning it was not joyful at all. Like I could maybe do 10-15 minutes very slowly, and it was a lot of discomfort, and it was a lot of like and like going like, and that, but it was difficult. And I think in terms of like a societal level, when it comes to things like eating meat or just the commandments of the Sharia in general, you know, you have Allah Azza wa Jal, who's in this position where he's the all-knowing, yeah, that he like his dealing with us and the long-term consequences of a particular action, he has complete knowledge of, yeah. We have this limited foresight, and I think in the same way, or well, to a worse degree, in the same way that my daughter, for example, is like, I want ice cream, yeah. I don't want that broccoli. She's reacting to these immediate feelings that she has. I think communities like the vegan community, or even extrapolating it further than that, you know, the atheistic, agnostic, political communities in general, in terms of the injunctions that they try to posit, free from the Sharia, free from the guidance of Allah Azza wa Jal, they're going to suffer in the same way, but to a more complex degree, of short-sightedness, of ignorance, as it would do with my daughter who wants to just eat ice cream and avoid eating broccoli. Yes, there are certain degrees of pain that are going to be inevitable in the meat industry or in the production of animal products. I don't think that they can, in any absolute sense, say that pain is going to be decreased. You can say that if you draw a circle around the pain, yeah. So, like, if in a slaughterhouse, do animals experience pain? Yes, of course they do. Yeah. And if you remove that slaughter, have you removed pain? Yes, you have removed pain from the world. But holistically speaking, yeah, if you take everything into consideration, has the net pain, yeah, in every single context connected to those animals that you're freeing from that slaughter, has the net pain reduced completely in terms of how much pain they would have experienced over life, or even in terms of like their interactions with the world? because they have interactions with the world as well, and they have an impact on the amount of pain that other animals around them may be experiencing or not.
Yeah.
Like, there's all these mad connections. The universe is really complex. Like, there was a really good video I watched on YouTube where they were talking about the what's that place called in America? There's like this district, like a natural reserve. I can't remember what it's called. Yosemite. I don't know. It's like this. It's just gonna bug me now trying to remember what that's called. So basically, it's like this big nature. No.
Or Niagara Falls.
No. Natural reserve, America. Introducing wolves. Yellowstone National Park. That's the one.
Okay.
So there's for those of you who want to watch it. Yeah, it's really interesting. Wolves saved Yellowstone National Park. They removed wolves from there. Yeah, because they were killing things. Empathy took hold. Yeah, and they're like, oh, we need, and we can't have them killing stuff. We can't have them killing humans. So they removed the predators from the area. But what happened was that the prey had nothing that was eating them, so they began to overpopulate. When they began to overpopulate, their food sources were diminished, and the fact that they were diminishing the food sources affected the environment that they lived in. So the rivers changed, yeah.
Okay.
And when they introduced predators into it, this reduced the numbers of the prey that the deer, the whatever it was that they were eating, and because the numbers of the prey were reduced, that meant that certain things could grow in certain areas that they were unable to grow in prior to that, and the environment transformed completely because of the introduction of a predator. Yeah, because of the increase in pain. And the thing is it's not even like removing the predator. Yeah, it's not even like removing the predator necessarily even reduced pain, because now you've got a higher population. They're all competing for food. It's very likely then as well that there was a higher number of them dying of starvation because you've got a higher number of them competing for their own food and things like that. But these things are complex. They have knock-on effects to not just other creatures, but to the environment, which then has, again, a knock-on effect on other creatures as well. So there's all of this complexity that often gets neglected, yeah? And this is the thing. It's like trying to see how far your actions can have an impact in the natural world.
Right.
How far can you see out? Certain people are going to be able to see the consequences to a different varying degree. But this is the problem. The human being can only ever see so far. There is a limit to how far they can see, to how much they can comprehend, because they also had to deal with things like ignorance, with short-sightedness. Now, so this is what it comes down to again is, okay, so who is best posited to be able to make these decisions about to what degree we should be allowed to eat meat or not? Yeah, to whether or not slaughtering is permissible or not, whether or not, in the grand scheme of things, this is something that is good or bad. Yeah. Who is in a better position to be able to make that decision? Is any group of humans going to be able to compete with an all-knowing, all-powerful creator? If an all-knowing, all-powerful creator exists, then ipso facto, they're not going to be able to compete, in terms of the injunctions of how to best organize a society. If Allah exists, which we believe he does, and I'm going to say he does, it's not just that we believe, whether or not we believe Allah Azza wa Jal exists, he has these attributes, and he is better posited to be able to make a decision on how we organize ourselves, what is right, what is wrong, what actions are permissible, what are not. And human beings, whenever they stray from that, whenever they try to develop their own systems of thought, always give rise, they think they're doing good, but it gives rise to a problem later on down the line. You see this even with like feminism. They all the things that they were crying for in the first few waves, they received, and as they've developed, they've gotten into the workplace and now competing with men, and now there are a number of consequences from that action which the first injunctions were meant to protect them from in the first place, and now they're complaining about it. So they, the harassment in the workplace, so on and so forth. yet these are problems that are going to express themselves
then
when
they're also not being satisfied. Like studies like bench flour also prove that now their happiness levels have gone down since the advent of
exactly
feminism.
yeah. So they had, in this idealistic way of thinking, they think, if we do this, then this is going to increase this and blah, 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 blah. But there's only so far that their considerations can go. And it's often the case that reality just comes and bites you in the butt.
And it makes sense, as you mentioned, that we as trying to remove God out of the equation can lead to short-sightedness in some sense, and come with absurd conclusions, which we might think that is plausible enough, but in the long run, maybe in the grand scheme of things, can have an adverse effect on the environment, on us, on society at large. And one of them can be like people now having this idea of antinatalism, which is kind of linked to veganism in some sense, for some people at least, as you were mentioning.
Well, I think what I would say that obviously not every vegan is an antinatalist.
Yeah, some of them, yeah.
But I think there is a number of them that are, and I would say that, like, if you accept certain propositions like atheism, or not even necessarily atheism, but if you accept utilitarianism, if you accept this certain thing, and if you are asserting certain things like the vegans assert, if you ask certain questions, I think it's very easy for someone to end up walking down the antinatalist route. And then even the antinatalist route.
For our viewers who don't understand what antinatalism is, basically, can you unpack?
So antinatalism is just this idea of being against the beginning of life. That it is immoral to allow life to begin, so that you should prevent life from starting. Because if a life comes into existence, you are condemning it to suffer, because life is suffering. And so bringing new life into being is to actively cause suffering to that being. And it is better that being does not exist, and so that it doesn't have to experience suffering. So you can see, I think, just intuitively, why being obsessed with this sort of removal of suffering might, in some cases, with some people, depending on the path of reasoning that they take, lead to propositions such as antinatalism. Antinatalism could be expressed just in terms of castration, preventing procreation, but it can even go as far, in its most extreme forms, as these archetypal bad guys that you see in movies like Thanos. Thanos is like the ultimate antinatalist. Or
exactly,
do you remember? Did you ever play Final Fantasy?
Sorry,
Did you ever play the?
Yeah.
Do you remember Final Fantasy number 9?
No.
So Final Fantasy 9, the boss in that, the end game boss, he's just like, suffering is bad. Suffering is bad. I need to end existence.
Yeah.
All of existence needs to go. Yeah, existence just cannot simply be, I'm going to end the universe. I'm going to turn existence off, boop, and nothing will exist, and therefore nothing will suffer. Yeah,
so
that's like the extreme of antinatalism.
So these radical views can, and in fact, using utilitarianism, someone can make these radical views also in some sense moral, and then nuking all the animals, for example, can also be justified with this same idea.
Oh, I've lost you. Oh, you back?
Yeah, I'm back. Which is kind of very problematic.
Exactly, but this is interesting now, because this. Have you ever seen these things where you've got these typical movies that are spoken about, and it's like you've got the good guy, you've got the bad guy, you've got Batman, and you've got the Joker, and you're like, Batman's obviously the good guy, the Joker is obviously the bad guy, and then people flip it, and they're like, no, the Joker was the good guy, the Joker was this revolutionary, and Batman is this rich man. Yeah, he's really, really wealthy, and he has everything he needs, and he spends his spare time beating up poor people that have been pushed towards criminality because they can't afford their basic necessities, because he works within this corporate world, and he's like a conservative American's free market whatever corporationist's wet dream. And like he's just going around and he's picking on the little man, and the Joker is someone like, and even in the most recent expression of the film, The Joker, I can't remember what the name of the guy is, but the one, it's really, really, really good. and they instill in you a sense of empathy for the Joker because you see how society made him the way he is.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so this complicates these things. Like, and when you're looking at these archetypal bad guys, like, if suffering is bad, and if life always, and if this is given, if life always leads to more suffering than it does pleasure, and that no amount of pleasure can ever make up for the suffering that any of these beings will experience, then it makes sense to say that you should not allow life to begin. And that, in a twisted way, can lead towards the justification of annihilationism. But, you know, like, for example, like, if you could just nuke all of the planet, yeah? If you had access to all the red buttons, and hypothetically speaking, you could set off all of the nukes all over the planet, all at the same time, and end life on Earth instantly, if you're stuck in this type of mentality, that can be a moral decision. And obviously, from the average person that's not really thought about it that deeply, they're going to see this guy as like the ultimate bad guy, straight out of a comic book. Yeah,
right.
But in terms of like, they might not even see how their own thinking might necessarily lead to his conclusion. He's just took it further. He's just walked that path of reason and let it go where it's supposed to go. Let it take him where it's supposed to take. Right. Yeah. Whereas the other person is just sort of like they only scratch the surface level of this particular thought.
Yeah.
And they just let certain actions manifest based on a particular degree of reasoning. But this person's continued that line of thinking, and it's like, no, actually, if we just stop life from existing altogether, that means there's not any more suffering.
Yeah,
and that is that not the utilitarian dream, to prevent suffering from happening at all? If suffering equals bad, is no suffering not better than some suffering or lots of suffering? And if you were to weigh up all of the pain and the way that people have to feel with pain, because this is another objection they make against religion, is the problem of suffering, the problem of evil in the world. Yeah,
exactly.
They say, how can God exist when there's so much suffering? Okay, so if all of this is such a big deal that you consider it to be a de facto defeater for the existence of a God, and you say that is it not better that this suffering does not exist at all? Then why should we not nuke the planet? Yeah,
exactly,
why should we not do that?
Exactly.
And obviously, some people are just gonna they're gonna say, no, well, that's absurd. And I agree, like, that is mad, isn't it? That is, but the question is if you're accepting certain propositions, yeah, and if you accept that there is no grander, because at least for us, suffering has a purpose. Suffering is a test which we are meant to overcome, and we're not allowed to opt out. Suicide is forbidden. Yeah, and you have to bear this suffering, and that Allah Azza wa Jal will recompense you on the Day of Judgment if you bear it with patience. All of this transforms. Like, you can see suffering as a good thing because you're going to get something better. There's a hadith that talks about the fact that the man who had a life of suffering, every single day was a pain for him. He died, and he's only dipped into paradise. He's not even walking around and enjoy the mansions yet. He's not eating from the trees or drinking from the rivers. He's not experienced it as like an interactive thing yet. He's dipped in it. I think a part of his body is placed in it, according to the hadith. And then he's asked, have you ever suffered? Keep in mind, we've just been told that he has, that his life was suffering. And then he's asked, have you ever suffered? His response to that is to say no. No, I have never suffered. Wow. And we can, and it's not inconceivable, because you can see this happen in life. There's a film called Patch Adams with Robin Williams, where he goes into the hospital, and his way of helping people overcome their suffering is to give them joy, make them laugh. And this helps. Someone who may have had a crappy life, if they win something at the casino, they may have had all these ailments, but all of a sudden it's as if they forgot they're ill. And they're up and like, or you have a horror dream, a nightmare. And it's like, while it's happening, it's terrifying. Some zombies trying to eat your face, you're falling, you're trying to punch something to defend yourself, but you can only move in slow motion. And you can't hurt it. And that causes severe anxiety, and it's like, what is going on? It's the worst dream I've ever had in my life. And then you wake up, and it's like, oh, and you go about your day without any trauma. Yeah, this is conceivable in this life. Now, if you imagine, like, how Allah describes paradise, it's beyond anything we can comprehend in terms of the pleasures that we can experience there. So it's not that difficult to think that if we can forget pain in the dunya because of mediocre experiences of joy and pleasure. If Allah Azza is going to grant us paradise, no matter how much pain you've had in life, it's going to seem like it's not a problem at all. So we have a framework that helps us to be able to deal with suffering. So suicide is forbidden. Injustice, ending the life of others, is forbidden. So we have this framework where that sort of end game result, Thanos, you can't be Thanos and be a Muslim. Yeah, you can't be the final boss in Final Fantasy IX and be a Muslim, because these things are strictly forbidden. And not only that, the things that are being referred to as evil, from the Islamic perspective, isn't an evil. Everything is good for the believer. If he experiences good, he says, Alhamdulillah, he is grateful, and so it is good for him. And when he experiences hardship, when he experiences hardship, he is thankful.
Patient. Yeah.
He's patient, and so it is. He's thankful. Yeah, he is patient, and so it is good for him. And another hadith: nothing befalls a believer, nothing of hardship, no anxiety, stress, suffering, not even the pricking of a thorn, but that Allah Azza wa Jal will expiate his sins by it. And it will be a means by which on the day of judgment, when he's looking at all of these sins that dissolved, because he bared his suffering with patience, and he watches it dissolve, he would have begged, oh Allah, I wish I had suffered more.
Subhanallah.
So that so like you compare this now to like the atheistic worldview, where you can't really look at the suffering in the same way as a Muslim. Yeah, we've got that framework where we're seeing these things happen the way that they happen, and we can transform that into something that's like, Alhamdulillah, like, where despite the difficulties that you may face, you can push through, and you can yearn for something better. You can yearn for, the pleasure of Allah Azza wa Jal. You can yearn to be in His presence, in Jannah. You can yearn for the mansions.
And also that brings us to another very important topic, which is animal suffering itself. Like, these days a very common argument that atheists try to make is not just human suffering. Of course, we can address that also. But moving on to animal suffering itself, they think that this is kind of a evidential defeater to theism. So, what is your view regarding, for example, animal suffering? Like, how does Islam address animal suffering?
So, with regards to animal suffering, so number one is, when they die, what happens? Allahu Alam. Like, I'm not sure. Allah could make it up for them. Yeah. In terms of how we understand to what degree they experience that suffering as well, Allahu Alam. Like, there's this the hard problem of consciousness, and that I cannot know how you experience the things you experience. Now, with regards to animals, there may be a robotic nature to them. It may, have you ever watched the film Avatar, or any film, in fact, where you're watching something play out and you feel empathy. You see the blue ladies crying because they blew up a tree, and you're like, oh, she's really sad. You might be moved by it and feel empathy for this thing, this blue lady who's, her special tree's just been blown up. How sad. So you can feel empathy for things because the external expression of that particular thing gives rise to this empathy. But the question now is that necessarily being experienced the way that you imagine it's being experienced?
I think it is known as theory of mind: first person, second person, third person perspectival, fourth person. Like, you can think about a person, and then that person is thinking about a person, and then we humans, I think we have the ability to go on till 5 levels, I think, like that. For example, you're watching a movie, and then within a movie, for example, a person is watching a movie, and you can still feel empathy for, moving
whatever is in the movie, which is weird. Like, you could extrapolate that even further, a movie within a movie, in a movie, in a movie, and still experience some sort of empathy for that thing, despite the fact that it's fictional.
Exactly.
So now the question is could Allah Azza wa Jal create animals in such a way so that we have these experiences of empathy for suffering that may not even be occurring the way that we imagine it occurs? That's number one. So there may be like a robotic nature to them. There may be a distinction between the human being and the animal kingdom, where like the suffering just doesn't express itself in the same way, or it could be like a robotic show because they don't have a soul, or whatever. Allahu Alam. And then even if they do experience suffering, Allah could make it up for them in the hereafter.
Exactly.
They keep Allah alam what I don't know what the Islamic narrative is with regards to. I can look into it. Whether or not there's an afterlife for animals. And from memory, and maybe people in the comments that are more clued up on this can correct me if I'm wrong, but from memory, I remember something maybe in the Hadith corpus that talks about even the ant will be held account for its injustices on the day of judgment.
Okay.
Or the animals will be called to give witness.
There's one hadith which is, I think, Sahih Muslim 252, which is that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the rights of justice will surely be restored to their people on the day of resurrection. Even the hornless sheep will lay claim to the horned sheep, which kind of implies that justice will be served even to the utmost level. Even on the animal level, where there is a horned sheep and there is a hornless sheep. So maybe that sheep had some kind of advantage, and for that maybe Allah would recompense, maybe Allah would redress what has been done in the human world. So
so even then, so if you're looking at that hadith that you've just read, and then you incorporate that with the other hadith that we mentioned about the man who had a life of suffering, and this is made up for him. If Allah is saying that even between two animals, there's no human involved in this interaction. There's a horned and the hornless sheep, and that there was an injustice between these two, and that injustice will be dealt with on the day of judgment. So Allah Azza wa Jalla is this all-powerful being that has it within him to be able to rectify affairs, however they've occurred, between whatever being on earth, to the degree that whatever has been experienced in the dunya will be considered rectified on the day of judgment. So even the man that suffered a life of suffering will be asked, have you ever suffered? The answer to that will be no. When they're in paradise, they will have wished that they'd experienced more suffering so that they could have received more blessings.
Exactly.
In paradise, because the blessings themselves are just unquantifiably
I think one response can be a very important point is that when it comes to these atheistic arguments, etc., which are against, for example, Islamic theism, is that they are not putting into account the whole Islamic framework. If they are trying to challenge the Islamic framework, what they are doing is they're trying to pinpoint to one aspect of Islam, or
they draw a circle.
And fit within their worldview, and because it is not fitting within their worldview, they think it is an evidential problem. For example, the evidential problem of animal suffering. But if you move on to the Islamic worldview, you have to look at the Islamic worldview from a holistic perspective, which means that we are not so far short-sighted that we would see this whole world, just this life, as the means and the end, only the end, but rather we have the afterlife. The afterlife, when you cannot go to a movie and watch first half of the movie and rate the movie based on that, and make
exactly. So can you share my screen quickly? So typically what they're doing is, so they're listing out a number of facts or a number of attributes of a particular thing. So they'll say, number one, we take into consideration this particular factory farm. Sorry, I'm trying to type with my mouse. Number two, there's say 100 animals in there. And number three, in this particular moment they experience pain. And then they draw a circle around that. And say this is unjust. And they limit it to us. Obviously, there's probably more facts than that. To fact number 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. But they draw a line around the things that they have mentioned and say this is an injustice. I was like, well, hold on, it's not just that. Within the Islamic framework, you have that hadith that talks about even on the day of judgment, that the two sheep will be able to give a dispute to Allah, and Allah will rectify their affairs. So animals will have the opportunity to seek justice. Animal justice. Number two, that Allah Azza wa Jalla is the all-powerful, and that He can give infinitely to whoever He wishes, to the degree that whatever they've occurred, or whatever that they've been through, it has been made up for once and then repeatedly for an eternity. So he's the all-powerful, he's the most capable, he's the just, he's the XYZ. There's all of these extra facts that the experience of whatever that they receive on the day of judgment will make them forget they'd even suffered at all. And that as well, like if Allah Azza wa Jalla wishes, he could make it so that in your mind it didn't even occur. You don't remember it at all. So I have that experience now. So I've got a scar on my face. Can you see? Yeah. So if you look really carefully, oh, that's brilliant lighting there. You can see it really well. So what basically happened was when I was 1 year old, I fell down some stairs. And I don't just have it there. I also have it here. There's a scar there. You can see.
Yeah.
And there's another one on my lip here. And the reason was because when I fell down these stairs, I had a plate. The plate smashed, and my face went into the broken plate.
Oh my!
And it shredded my face open, and I nearly bled to death on the floor. My mum found me. They had to take me to the hospital. My cheek was hanging off because this was a lot bigger. As I've grown, obviously my face has gotten bigger. So the scar doesn't look as bad as it does, and under certain lighting, you can see that it was really big. Like my cheek was pretty much hanging off. My eye was really damaged. My lip was sliced open, and so there was blood everywhere. They sewed me up. I can't remember if it was like 13 stitches or something mad. So I had a lot of stitches, and the pictures of me as a baby with all of these, you're looking at it and you're like, I imagine that hurt a lot. Like that looked very painful. Yeah. Now, can I recall that pain? No. I can't. I do not have a single memory of what that felt like. Like I don't even have. Like it's literally just something I see in the mirror. Yeah, I don't have any recollection of that pain, and because I have no recollection of that pain, I don't really care whether or not it happened. If anything, people like the scar. Yeah, I've been complimented by people because they like scars. They're like, oh yeah, it looks very nice. Ooh, like it's something they're into. So, like, if anything, I'm sort of to a certain degree grateful that it happened. Yeah, I like the scar. It's a unique part of me. Yeah, it's something that identifies me as different to other people. So for me, it's not that big of an issue. Like I felt this pain. I can imagine that it hurt. Yeah. But my memory of it is gone, and I'm left with something that is cool for some people. I'm not really that bothered about it. But the point is that like pain down the line can be forgotten. Number two, you can receive something from that makes it make you thankful that you had to go through it for whatever reason. And the fact that you don't even remember the pain as well, it's a bonus because now you got all of this extra stuff, and you don't have to remember the fact that you went through it in the first place. So, if that is the case in the akhirah, in the afterlife, on the day of judgment, in paradise, if you're in paradise and you have these mountains and these mansions and this food and these rivers and all of the blessings that paradise entails, if you've got all of that and you can't remember all of the pain that you went through, you're not going to give a crap about the pain.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Exactly.
The fact that atheist Harry on Earth is like, oh, but this is shit. It would have been better if that didn't happen. You're going to be saying, I wish I'd have had more pain.
Yeah.
If this is what I was getting, I'd have been happy if that was 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times over. If I had to deal with that for 10,000 years to get this for an eternity, I would go back now and happily do that. If that is the case, then this emotional objection that the atheist has or the vegan has that, animal suffering is irrelevant. It really is irrelevant. It's not. And this idea that, it would have been better if it didn't occur. How do you know? Can you, you are saying that now, as a finite human being with limited access to information and limited sight into the future. And can you say that if you were Allah and you were all-knowing and you had wisdom and all of these godly attributes, would you say the same thing as you were saying now? You can't say that your opinion would be identical at all. Are you still there? I've lost you. Mashallah, it's frozen on a very handsome face. You've got a good freeze face. Whenever you'll see this after maybe. Whenever it freezes on my face, it always freezes on a terrible.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, I missed.
So I was saying, mashallah, when it freezes for you, your froze face is like a model picture. You know, when it's like mashallah, yeah, I could see it on the cover of some bloody magazine. Yeah. When it freezes for me, I look like I'm broken. I'm like I always have like a proper ugly frozen face. Mashallah, every time it's frozen for you, it's the opposite. But yeah, so what was I saying? So and they say, oh, but the world would be better if this thing didn't exist. And my point was, so you're saying that now, while you have limited information, limited wisdom, limited foresight, limited power. Now, I'm going to ask the question now. If you had every piece of information, if you were all knowing, if you were all powerful, if you were all wise, if you were the most just, the most merciful, etc., if you were all of these things, would your opinion be identical to the opinion that you have now, with limited information, with limited foresight, with limited knowledge, with limited wisdom? Are you saying that with all of these deficiencies that you have, that you're able to come to the same conclusion you would do if you were a perfect being? You can't really say that that your opinion would be identical, and that if you did have these godly attributes, that you wouldn't come to the same conclusion that has manifested now. You wouldn't end up doing what God is doing. So this is another fault that I see in their thinking, is that they just sort of like assume that there has to be a certain level of humility here, that they cannot say that their opinion of how things should be would be the same had they had access.
Exactly. I mean, I was just going to say that this also involves some kind of level of arrogance, where they say that they are making a conclusion about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Hakim, He's Al-Bar, He's the source of all goodness, He's all-knowing, He's Al-Alim, He's the all-wise, He's the all-merciful. And if a God with these attributes is doing something, it takes a lot of arrogance to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot inhibit suffering, or cannot recompense or redress for that kind of suffering that we see in this world. So for example, if a vegan, if a person, if an atheist, he is the one who wants to end, he's the one who wants to end animal suffering or do something about it. But who can actually do something about the animal suffering that is present? It is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I believe in this aspect also, I think they have to understand that they need a worldview which actually provides an explanation as to why there is suffering, and they need a worldview which kind of gives an explanation as to what would happen after the suffering has been done. Like there would be some kind of redress or not. So I think in this case, I think we can make a point where we can show that this worldview, like the Islamic worldview, is a far better worldview than the atheistic worldview or the vegan ideology or the vegan idea that they adhere to it so much, because I believe it is a very depressing worldview. It is a very depressing worldview in some sense, where you are saying where let's compare the two worldview. Okay, so like we have, for example, the vegan worldview and the atheistic worldview. This worldview is saying that for example, that the animal that suffered and died, for example, the rat that got some kind of a disease and lived a life full of suffering and died. There is no afterlife within this worldview. This means that this rat stays miserable, or this misery of this rat is there for eternity. There is no kind of undoing of that. There is no kind of recompensing, the redressing, or no kind of compensation, or nothing done to that. But whereas within the Islamic worldview, if we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would redress, would recompensate, something with something better, we have a worldview which is far better than this depressing worldview, where there is nothing happening there. But whereas within our worldview, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala within the afterlife is going to do something about it, and is going to give something better. So what is your view regarding that?
So this is an interesting thing now, because what it boils down to, is we need to be asking more fundamental questions. Because I think inevitably the conversation should be going down the route of, does God exist, and is Islam true? And basically we have to bring this back to Go Rap, or to a Dawa conversation, because what we sort of discussed now. So number one, typically the veganism arguments, when you're looking at how they sort of express themselves on popular media, on YouTube, in the news and things like that, there's numbers of things that are just taken for granted. Yeah, the conversation about whether or not God exists and whether or not a particular religion is true is not something that often is brought to this discussion. Yeah,
exactly.
There's a number of assumptions that are just sort of being played with, and then people are just saying, "Oh no, but you're causing suffering." It's a very rudimentary form of the conversation that expresses itself. Then what we say is, well, this should be part of the conversation. Does God exist? And is Islam true in particular?
Because this is more foundational than these topics, I believe.
Yes, and if the answer to this question is yes, God does exist, and yes, Islam is true, then we don't really have to worry about veganism. I don't need to become a vegan at all. I can, it's permissible for me to slaughter an animal on Eid and to feed and distribute the meat between the poor, and for me to eat that. It's perfectly fine, so long as the animal has not been treated in such a manner that is considered impermissible from an Islamic perspective. I can eat meat. And the conversation ends there. Now, and what they'll generally do is the conversation will shift then to animal suffering, or the problem of suffering, and they'll say that this is an evidence against God. And what we've shown is, no, that's not necessarily the case at all. It doesn't follow from the fact that animals suffer, or that there is an existence of suffering in any form or shape in its limited degree on the earth that is evidence that God does not exist. Now, if this is not a sufficient defeater for the Islamic principle, then we have to say, okay, so what is a good reason to be a Muslim? Yeah, if the argument from suffering is not a good defeater, is not a good thing, a good argument to put forward that undermines Islam as a true religion, then what we need to do is we need to shift this conversation away from the discussion of veganism to the proofs of prophethood, for example. Why is it that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the messenger of Allah? Why is the Quran, a discussion about the revelation or the veracity of the Quran as a candidate of divinely given word from Allah Azza wa Jalla himself, the words of the Creator? You put forward arguments for this. What you'll notice is with these discussions, they got nothing to do with veganism. Yeah. We have to move away from that, because there's more fundamental, more primary questions that we need to be discussing. And if these primary questions could be answered, if the answer to the question that God exists, that God is one, the Quran is the word of Allah Azza wa Jal, that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a messenger of Allah, and the fact that in each of these eating meat is permissible is not sufficient to undermine the truthfulness of this religion, then you've not got basically, this is well, I would say we need to sort of move it towards primary discussions, principal points, foundational topics. And people get stuck in the sticks talking about but animals suffer, as if that's just something that's a given, something that's obvious, that would somehow undermine the Islamic position. It isn't at all.
And of course, some of the things that they mentioned, that is important to address this also, is that some of these kind of cruelty stuff that is going on currently within the world is something we would also speak up against, because within the Islamic Islamic worldview, there are some rights sometimes that are violated within these kind of slaughterhouses, we believe clearly that some one animal shouldn't be in front of another animal being slaughtered, and this is something that we have to take care about. And there are many other rights, and these are very where kind of nuanced rights that needs to be followed. And there are some Muslims who kind of, because these rights have been violated, they become vegan because they want to avoid these kind of violation. So this is also possible. You can be a Muslim and you can be a vegan. That is also fine. But coming back to the philosophical idea of veganism, which I believe is inadequate in some sense, where if speaking to a vegan, if the all you want is for example, end animal suffering, and this is a very foundational thing for you, I think for them also, I think what they need is actually a worldview like Islam, which can provide a robust explanation, a robust methodology, and tell them, like, how animal suffering can be avoided in the right sense, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to live your life in a way where you can, have a moral framework and abide by that kind of moral framework, which is objective and robust in nature. So
Yeah, I agree. And so then we basically take this down a dawah route, and inevitably, like I said, the conversation shifts away from a discussion of animal rights and more to theological discussions about the veracity of Islam as a religion, the proofs of prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the proofs of revelation in terms of the Quran, proofs of Tawheed, these kind of things. You put forward this, and the discussion can take a change, and you can start talking about these more fundamental things. And you will find that if people are convinced, like this, like for me, for example, I was vegetarian, pescatarian. When I became a Muslim, I shifted away from that, and eventually I started eating meat again because I consider that obviously Allah is in a better position to be able to tell me what is right or wrong than I am. I am limited in my scope and limited in my ability. I do believe that there is sufficient reason to believe in Islam as being true, but this is obviously an entirely separate discussion. We've been going for a couple of hours now, so it's probably a good
of
time
course, we can have so when it comes to the veracity of Islam, I think we can, inshallah, I can have more videos on, like, making a case for Islam and making a case for God's existence and the oneness of God, and for example revelation and prophethood, etc., etc., inshallah ta'ala. But coming back to, maybe, for example, a closing remark that I would want to say, for example, is that, for vegans, like, if, like, we can go through these topics later on, but as to what, like, from an Islamic perspective, what can I say to a vegan as a closing remark would be, unless you don't have the creator and sustainer of the universe in your ontology, who is all just and merciful, you cannot adequately recompense for the suffering animals have gone through. It's only Allah who can. Just imagine a worldview that claims that the hornless goat, which was always suffered in some sense by the horned goat, dies in pain, stays beaten for eternity. This is a far depressing worldview where there is no justice being served. Islam has the solution to animal suffering. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recompense for all the suffering animals have gone through. You cannot, I cannot, we all cannot collectively. Therefore, vegans need Islam. Islam is a worldview that offers an actual viable solution to animal suffering. So what
I would say that's a good summary. Yeah, no, I would say that's a good summary. But Islam is a coherent foundation from which you can live your life and seek guidance from. That if you're looking at the way that, because in terms of veganism, what you'll see is a lot of these people, they are looking for a purpose. Yeah. And especially the activists, they're going out there and they're fighting for something. This, in a sense, is giving their life a meaning. Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that many of these people are sort of yearning for. They are yearning for something to fight for, something to, aim at. To have a vision, have a goal, and move
something
towards. And they have
themselves, something beyond.
Yes, and they exactly, they have this sense of justice being something important, justice being something that should be sought out. And the thing is the way that it expresses itself from like a secular perspective, I think it's problematic, very misguided, and it leads to other things that give rise to more problems that end up undermining the things that they try to push for anyway. Like what you'll see is the expression of a lot of these activists leads towards a distaste of veganism and animal rights discussions completely, to the degree that you get the popularization of carnivore diets in an extreme sense as a sort of pushback towards, and you see these being popularized by the likes of Jordan Peterson and his daughter Michaela, for example. They're actively promoting carnivore diets, and obviously it can sort of express itself in this weird, confused way, or people just simply getting annoyed. You get Piers Morgan, who's like eating a burger, on TV to mock the vegan, and it's sort of like the way that it's done is it's belittling the whole process. Like from an Islamic perspective, eating meat isn't a game. It's not. It's not something that is not something like we show great appreciation for it. We understand the process of it. Like we're even supposed to be present in the process of slaughtering. You're supposed to witness it at some point. You know what I mean? You're like the Eid sacrifice. This is something you're supposed to be doing yourself. You're supposed to appreciate the difficulty of ending the life of a thing. And the fact that there is a sacrifice being made here, and the difficulty and the squeamishness of having to like prepare the meat. Like all of this is very difficult, and being a part of that process helps you to appreciate it, and it helps you to be thankful when you are eating it, of like what Allah has provided for you here. When it's sort of trivialized the way someone like Piers Morgan trivializes it, where it just becomes like a joke, it's a meme. He's just eating a burger now. They're not. You can't really see that there's any consideration of the animal, or anything that any sacrifice or any blessing that's in there. There's no like deeper sense of appreciation. It is more of like a joke. It is more mock culture that's sort of embedded in that. Whereas Islam is something that is really trying to push in you. Animals do have rights. Animals, have they require certain levels of empathy to the degree that people get thrown into the hellfire for their mistreating of animals. The woman who was the people may have even, I think, am I right? There's a hadith about a woman that people thought she was pious, but she ended up in the hellfire because she was cruel to a cat.
Exactly.
Or even though there was a woman who people would have maybe have belittled and mocked her. I think she was a prostitute or something. And she gave a dog water.
Yeah.
She was kind to an animal. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even when his army was marching past a pregnant dog, he stationed a guard next to the dog who had its pups to protect the dog from people passing it. And so the rights of the animals is something that's like implicit within the Islamic framework. And if you are looking for a sense of meaning, for a sense of purpose, Islam is a very convincing religion. And if you do give it, because a lot of people bat religion off wholesale, because especially in the West, they have a bad experience with Christianity. They think it's absurd, and they just sort of brush every religion with the same brush. Then, and Islam just really isn't equivalent at all to Christian Trinitarian doctrine, for example. The concept of Tawheed is way more palatable to the average person. And I think if you can overcome these sort of prejudices against religion wholesale, and you do give Islam a go, you at least try and read the Quran. It's not like the Bible either. Like the Bible, I've got a couple of copies. This is really small here. I don't have wudu, so I'm going to start touching the Quran and the Bible. But basically, the Bible, it looks smaller, but it's not. There's like they're really, really thin pages. And there's like a ridiculous thousands of pages of paper in the Bible. And the Quran looks bigger there, but the pages are thicker and there's less. And people can memorize the Quran, because it's more succinct and it's more useful in terms of the way that it's compiled. And it's just it's like Allah says, He's made it easy to remember. And if you go to any mosque during the month of Ramadan, you'll see someone every day, it's been broken up into 30 parts, and they'll recite the Quran from memory every day for 30 days. If they make one single mistake in its recitation, you got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people in the back that will correct him. So in terms of the equivalence, it's not the same. Islam is not like Christianity. We have a book that has been preserved from the time of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have Tawheed, which is a coherent understanding and view of our Creator that doesn't give rise to the contradictions that you see present within ideologies like Christianity or Hinduism. It gives a better explanation of the existence, of notions of justice, of why we exist, of our purpose and our meaning, of our interactions, relation to animals, all of these things, than atheism, than the alternatives. If you give it its due and look into it, I think you will find that Islam makes a great case for its truthfulness, and it is something that can provide you with that meaning that you're looking for. It can provide you with a sense of justice. It can provide you with that guidance, not just for you, but for your family, those who come from you. And as well, it doesn't lead to these notions of anti-natalism. In terms of even that, on many levels, I think we've sort of expressed as well that Islam is gonna have victory over these things. So yeah, so I think this is a good place to leave it. Obviously, there's
Yeah,
many other topics of conversation that have sort of been opened up,
yeah.
but just due to time
So,
constraints, we've got to sort of.
mashallah, we've covered so much. Like, I wasn't even expecting we would touch so many different subjects altogether. So overall, it was a very good discussion, and Jazakallah khairan for coming. I think there's so much that we've put forth for people to take from, and I hope it is the audience like it and it is helpful for them. And we would look forward to have you coming again and again on our platform, inshallah ta'ala, and addressing
Inshallah.
topics like these. Jazakallah khairan.
Wayak, it's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation. And mashallah, very good host. Mashallah, very handsome. Mashallah, he's got the aesthetics on point. He's got the chin stroke to a perfection. And yeah, it's been great talking to you today, brother. I look forward to speaking with you again. Jazakallah khair for having me on.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.